She was the girl in the red beret who made a nation cry. Ali MacGraw's face, tear-streaked and luminous in Love Story, became one of the defining images of early 1970s Hollywood. But the woman behind that image spent the better part of a decade living something far less romantic than the movie that made her famous. Now, in her mid-80s, MacGraw has spent years looking back, in her memoir, in interviews, in quiet reflection from her home in New Mexico, at what it actually meant to be married to Steve McQueen, the man the world called the King of Cool. This is her story, told through her own words and the record she has left behind. Ali MacGraw was born in 1939 in Pound Ridge, New York, into a household that gave her little of the confidence she would later need to survive Hollywood. Her parents were both artists, and their marriage was strained by money troubles and unhappiness that MacGraw absorbed as a child. She has said in interviews that she grew up believing love was something unstable, something that could be withdrawn at any moment, a belief that would shape nearly every relationship she entered as an adult. As a young woman, she gravitated toward fashion rather than film. She studied art history at Wellesley College before moving to New York, where she worked as an assistant to the legendary Vogue editor Diana Vreeland, then moved into styling and photography work, quietly building an eye for image-making before she ever stood in front of a camera herself. She spent years behind the scenes of the fashion industry, arranging shoots and studying the language of image and pose long before anyone thought to point a movie camera at her. Hollywood found her almost by accident. In 1968, she landed a small role in A Lovely Way to Die, but it was 1969's Goodbye, Columbus, a modest but well-reviewed adaptation of the Philip Roth novella, that made critics take notice. Her performance as the wealthy, self-assured Brenda Potemkin carried a naturalism that stood out against the more theatrical acting styles still common in Hollywood at the time. It was a promising start. Nothing, however, could have prepared her for what came next. That same year, MacGraw married Robert Evans, then the head of production at Paramount Pictures and one of the most powerful men in the industry. In 1970, Evans put her in Love Story, opposite Ryan O'Neal, and the film became a cultural phenomenon, one of the highest-grossing movies of its era and the role that would define MacGraw for the rest of her life. She earned an Academy Award nomination. Magazine covers followed. In 1971, she and Evans had a son, Joshua. Love Story was, by any measure, an era-defining hit. Built around the tagline, "Love means never having to say you're sorry," the film grossed well over $100 million worldwide against a tiny budget and turned its two young leads into instant icons of a certain kind of romantic tragedy. MacGraw, in particular, became a fashion touchstone. Her wardrobe from the film, her hairstyle, even her ribbed knit hats were copied across the country. She was, for a brief but intense stretch, one of the most photographed women in America. From the outside, it looked like the fullest possible version of a Hollywood life. A hit film, a powerful husband, a new baby, a career on the rise. MacGraw has since described this period with more ambivalence than the glossy photograph suggested, a sense that she was performing contentment as much as living it, and that the marriage to Evans, for all his generosity in building her career, was already showing strain by the time The Getaway came along. That ambivalence would soon be tested by a film that was supposed to be just another job. In 1972, Evans arranged for MacGraw to star opposite Steve McQueen in The Getaway, a Sam Peckinpah action thriller shot largely on location in Texas. McQueen was, by that point, arguably the biggest movie star on the planet, the anti-hero of Bullitt and The Great Escape, a man whose off-screen life with motorcycles and race cars fed directly into his on-screen mystique. He carried himself with the wary self-containment of someone who had clawed his way up from genuine hardship, a childhood spent bouncing between relatives, a stint in reform school, years of manual labor and small-time hustling before acting gave him an outlet for all that restlessness. MacGraw was 12 years younger than McQueen and, by her own account, entirely unprepared for the effect he had on her. She has written that she felt an immediate, unsettling pull toward him, and that some part of her recognized the danger of it before filming even began. She would later describe the attraction as almost chemical, something that bypassed reason entirely, the sense that when McQueen walked into a room, everyone in it, regardless of age or relation to him, simply turned to look. In her 1991 memoir, Moving Pictures, she acknowledged sensing that getting close to McQueen would cause her serious trouble, and she went ahead anyway, drawn in despite every warning sign she could see clearly even as it was happening. The affair that developed on location in Texas became one of the most talked-about Hollywood romances of the decade, and the publicity around it only fed interest in the film. But the personal fallout was severe. MacGraw filed for divorce from Evans by the end of 1972, ending a marriage that had, only a few years earlier, defined her public life. Evans was reportedly blindsided. The rupture between the two men, the producer who built her career and the star who took her from him, became so notorious within the industry that it was later dramatized in the Paramount Plus series The Offer, about the making of The Godfather. In the summer of 1973, Ali MacGraw and Steve McQueen married. It had all the surface glamour of a fairy tale. What MacGraw has since described is something closer to a trade she didn't fully understand she was making. McQueen asked her to sign a prenuptial agreement waiving any claim to his fortune if the marriage ended. More significantly, he made clear that he did not want a working wife. MacGraw, at the height of her fame, arguably more bankable at that moment than McQueen himself, agreed to step away from acting almost entirely. She has said plainly, in interviews given decades later, that she did it out of fear. Fear that if she didn't accommodate him, she would lose him the way she had lost so much stability as a child. Their early life together, in a house near the Malibu coastline, had genuine happiness in it. There were quiet years of surfing, motorcycles, barbecues with a small circle of friends, and a domestic rhythm that MacGraw, for a time, found grounding after the chaos of her rapid rise to fame. But the arrangement asked something enormous of her. McQueen was, by MacGraw's account, deeply possessive, jealous to the point of controlling her movements and her friendships, while reserving for himself a freedom he didn't extend to her. She has spoken about the double standard directly. McQueen's own reputation for pursuing other women was well known even as he policed her every interaction. McQueen's difficult childhood, a father who abandoned the family, a mother who sent him away to relatives and later to a school for troubled boys, left him, in MacGraw's telling, with a permanent distrust that he never fully resolved. She has said she understood where his fear of abandonment came from, and that understanding it didn't make living inside it any easier. She gave up premieres, scripts, and the professional identity she had spent years building, and in her memoir she described settling into a role she hadn't expected for herself. Cook, housekeeper, full-time keeper of someone else's peace of mind. By the mid-1970s, the marriage that had begun in tabloid glamour had curdled into something quieter and much darker. MacGraw has described a household defined less by affection than by tension. Long silences, unpredictable moods, and a growing distance between two people who had once seemed inseparable. Both she and McQueen struggled with alcohol during this period. McQueen's substance use, by most accounts including MacGraw's own, escalated significantly, and she has acknowledged that she began drinking more heavily herself as a way of coping with the isolation. She has said that she was frightened of speaking honestly with him, worried that any expression of her own needs or unhappiness would drive him away entirely. So instead of confronting the growing distance, she absorbed it. It's a dynamic she has since discussed with some clarity. A woman who had built her sense of safety around not upsetting the people she depended on, repeating a pattern she had learned long before she ever met Steve McQueen. The very instability she had grown up trying to manage in her parents' household had followed her, in a different form, into her own marriage. Rumors of McQueen's infidelities circulated through Hollywood, and for a time MacGraw chose not to look at them too closely, telling herself that the man she had fallen for during The Getaway was still in there somewhere, obscured by the drinking and the distance rather than gone entirely. But the whispers eventually became impossible to ignore, and the humiliation of hearing about them secondhand, from friends and colleagues rather than from her own husband, wore away at whatever certainty remained. MacGraw has admitted that, after enough humiliation and enough loneliness, she too sought comfort outside the marriage. What had once been an all-consuming passion had become, in her words, a cycle of hurt answered by more hurt, each betrayal, real or suspected, making the next one feel almost inevitable. Friends who knew the couple during these years have described a household that outsiders rarely saw. McQueen retreating for days at a time, MacGraw increasingly alone in a beautiful house that had started to feel more like a holding pattern than a home. The gap between the public image of the couple, young, gorgeous, impossibly glamorous, and the private reality of two people slowly wearing each other down became, in MacGraw's later telling, one of the loneliest experiences of her life. By 1977, MacGraw had reached a breaking point. She told McQueen she wanted to return to acting, not simply for the work, but to reclaim a sense of herself that she felt she had handed over when she married him. According to McQueen's biographers, his response was immediate and unambiguous. If she went back to work, he told her, they would divorce. For MacGraw, the finality of that ultimatum confirmed something she had feared all along, that her own ambitions had never really been welcome in the marriage at all. She went ahead anyway, accepting a role in Convoy, directed once again by Sam Peckinpah. There was a brief, half-hearted attempt at reconciliation, but the trust between them had already broken down beyond repair. Their divorce was finalized in 1978, after 5 years of a marriage that had given MacGraw both some of the most intense passion of her life and some of its deepest damage. Steve McQueen died 2 years later, in November 1980, at the age of 50, from mesothelioma, a cancer linked to asbestos exposure he had encountered years earlier, including during his time in the Marine Corps and around industrial materials used in racing. His death stunned an industry that still saw him as an indestructible icon of masculinity and rebellion. MacGraw has said that even after everything, the control, the double standards, the years of walking on eggshells, she still loved him, and that his death left a grief she hadn't expected to feel so completely. She has spoken since of wishing they could have grown old together sober, a version of their story that addiction and pride made impossible. MacGraw was 41 when McQueen died, already several years removed from their divorce but still, in her own description, unmoored by the finality of losing him. Her drinking, which had crept up during the marriage, deepened afterward. She continued working through the 1980s, a role in Convoy, a well-received run on the primetime soap Dynasty in the mid-1980s, but she has said openly that Hollywood had largely moved past her, and that she no longer had the appetite to fight for a place in an industry that had once made her its biggest new star. By the early 1990s, her drinking had become, in her own words, unmanageable. She has described reaching a point where the alcohol that had once numbed the loneliness of her marriage to McQueen had become its own separate problem, one that threatened to undo whatever stability she had managed to rebuild in the years since the divorce. She entered treatment at the Betty Ford Center, beginning a recovery process that forced her to confront not just the addiction itself but the years of fear, control, and self-erasure that had fed it. Therapy and sobriety, she has said, gave her language for patterns she had lived inside for decades without ever naming them, the instinct to make herself smaller so that the people she loved wouldn't leave. In 1991, she published Moving Pictures, a memoir that was strikingly candid about her childhood, her marriages, and the cost of the fame she had chased and then partly regretted. Reviewers at the time noted how unusually unflattering MacGraw was willing to be about her own choices, refusing to cast herself simply as a victim of famous men and instead examining her own complicity in the years she spent shrinking to fit beside them. The book became a bestseller, in large part because readers recognized in her account something more universal than a Hollywood scandal, a story about losing yourself inside someone else's expectations, and the long work of finding your way back. In 1994, MacGraw left Los Angeles behind for good and moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, trading film sets for a quieter life centered on gardening, painting, and a spiritual practice she has credited with much of her healing. Now in her mid-80s, MacGraw has been sober for more than 3 decades, a milestone she has said she once assumed she would never reach. She never remarried, choosing instead, in her telling, to build a life defined by friendship and independence rather than another partnership built on compromise. Her bond with her love story co-star Ryan O'Neal endured long after the film's fame faded. The two reunited on stage in 2016 for a touring production of Love Letters, a reminder to audiences of the chemistry that first made them famous. She has continued to speak with unusual honesty about her years with McQueen. She has never denied the pull he had over her, describing the connection between them as something almost chemical, something she recognized as dangerous from the very beginning. But she has also resisted turning her story into a simple morality tale. She has said plainly that she does not see herself as a victim, that the years with McQueen contain genuine joy alongside genuine pain, and that both things can be true of the same marriage. She has also spoken about finding new purpose later in life outside of acting altogether, lending her name and creative energy to projects that celebrate craftsmanship and independence rather than the kind of image-making that defined her 20s and 30s. It is, in some ways, the quiet inverse of the life she once lived with McQueen, work built on collaboration and self-direction rather than on accommodating someone else's demands. What emerges from Ali MacGraw's own account of those years is not simply a story about a famous, difficult man, but about a woman who spent much of her early adulthood organizing her life around someone else's fear, and the long, deliberate work it took her, decades later, to put herself back at the center of it. She does not ask for pity in telling it, and she has been clear that she doesn't see herself that way. What she offers instead is something rarer than a scandal, an honest accounting, from someone who lived it, of how love and harm can occupy the same years, sometimes the same rooms, without one ever fully canceling out the other. She has outlived the fairy tale that Hollywood once sold about her marriage to Steve McQueen, and she has replaced it with something harder one and, by her own account, far more honest.